I welcome you to this, our 27th annual conference. I extend a warm welcome to the representatives of our respective founding institutions, Case-Western Reserve University School of Law, represented this evening by our Dean and Co-President of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute, Bob Rawson, who you will be meeting in just a moment, and to the University of Western Ontario and its Faculty of Law, represented by Dean Ian Holloway, who you will be meeting tomorrow evening. I likewise extend a warm welcome to our national directors, Professor Kai Carmody from the University of Western Ontario, and to John Gretzinger, our U.S. director from right here at Case-Western Reserve. The class change happens at about 6:30, so you're going to see some students start filling in. I apologize in advance for the distraction, but that's where some of the empty seats are here as our students will be moving to and fro in advance. I likewise extend a very special welcome to the members of our executive committee that are here in attendance from Canada, in Toronto in particular, Selma Lessenberg, Larry Herman of Castles Brock, Jim McElroy of McElroy and McElroy, and Michael Robinson of Faskins Martineau, and likewise from the U.S. and Washington, D.C. in particular, Dick Cunningham of Steptoe & Johnson and Rick Newcomb of DLA Piper U.S. We do have a third executive committee member from the U.S., Don Cameron of Troutman Sanders, who will be joining us tomorrow. Don's back in D.C. paying the bills, so to speak, on a client matter, unexpected client matter. And as I stated earlier, for those of you keeping score, that was four Canadian executive committee members and 3 U.S. I assure you that the Institute is inherently bilateral, and we appreciate the equality and equivalency in our relationship. We just have a vacancy on the U.S. side right now that we will be remedying in short order. I extend a welcome as well and our heartfelt appreciation to the members of our advisory board that are here in attendance, too numerous to name individually. But one of the most treasured assets of our institute, beyond our 2 founding institutions at Case-Western Reserve University School of Law and the University of Western Ontario, is that third vital organ of our institute, which is our public and private sector advisory board. For conceptual purposes, for presentation purposes, we often break those 3 organs into distinct tracks. But to be quite clear, everything that we do in the Institute is inextricably intertwined between those 3 vital organs. Things that appear to be items just in the classroom, within the ivy-covered walls, so to speak, do involve our practitioners, many of whom teach our classes, many of whom are engaged with our students on an everyday basis, and likewise, as you'll see throughout this weekend, our events that are, quote, for the outside world, the public sector and private sector, often include, and always include, members of our faculty and staff. With that, I think as many of us feel this weekend, we have mixed emotions. As you know, this is the first time that we've convened at this annual conference since the passing of our chairman, Henry King. I think many of us this morning woke up thinking, just waiting to see Henry and his phone calls and ringing of the bell and the like. Henry passed away on May 9th of 2009. We at the Case-Western Reserve, as well as his family, have celebrated his life with several memorial services, not the one that you will see tomorrow, some footage of from September. Many of you participated and attended that event. And we have honored Henry in a number of ways, and you will be hearing about that throughout the weekend, and you'll see the tributes tomorrow, but not the least of which was we've renamed this conference. It's dedicated in his name. This is now the Henry T. King Conference on Canada-U.S. Relations, which really isn't much of a change. We all called it Henry's Conference anyway. It's just formalizing what had always been the case. We will also be honoring Henry and preserving his legacy through launching our Henry T. King International Law Studies Fund, which you will be hearing about tomorrow evening as well as part of the overall tribute. I encourage you throughout this weekend, you will know that there's no shortage of aspects of the Institute named after Henry or in this law school named after Henry, and I encourage you to look at some of those during your stay here over the next couple of days. As I said, it's with mixed emotion because this has been one of the most exciting and dynamic years for our Institute, marked today by the appointments and announcement of our co-chairs, Minister James Peterson and Governor Jim Blanchard. And while we spent a great deal of time working on our co-chairs, we were excited as we met with the governor and the minister and talking about this and the ideas that they had. One of the practical consequences is we didn't realize they're both named Jim. So as we've been throughout the past several months, it's Jim, and we just, well, which one, the Canadian or the American? So finally we've just started referring to them as the Gov for the governor and the minister, as Mint for those of you familiar with Canadian speak, Minister of International Trade, Mint. And you put them together, it's government, and the jokes just write themselves at that point. We at the Institute, again, recognize that not only do we have the benefit of our public and private sector advisory board, but our home, our roots, or as we say back in Youngstown, our roots rest in our two academic institutions. And it is the support of the administration, faculty, and staff that continue at each of those institutions that continues to render this institute forward. And with that, it is my great privilege and pleasure to introduce the Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law and our co-president, Bob Rossman.
Thank you, Dan, and good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to add my welcome to Dan's to each and every one of you. I want to add special welcome to our colleagues from Western Ontario, to the members of the Executive Committee of the Institute and the Advisory Board, without whom we couldn't function as the Institute that we all relish so much. Our faculty and our students are very much looking forward to participating with you in this exciting conference. A bit of history. Some of you may have been around from the beginning, but we trace our roots with the Canada-U.S. Law Institute back to 1976, formed jointly in partnership with the University of Western Ontario. And since its inception, the Institute has had a very broad mandate to expose successive generations of students on both sides of the border to the importance of the relationship, the special relationship between the United States and Canada. If you take just a snapshot of Case Western Reserve University at this point in our law school, you would find that we have, by count, 110 faculty and students who participate in one way or another in the activities of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute and in Canada-U.S. activities. These include work in the classroom, such as more than 24 curricular and research opportunities that are available. It includes exchange opportunities with both Western Ontario and the faculty of the University of Ottawa faculty. It includes both the Canada-U.S. Law Journal and the Niagara Moot Court Competition. And if you'll permit me a parochial aside, I can't desist from mentioning that in the most recent round of the Canada-U.S. International Law competition, the Case Western Reserve team finished second and placed several oralists and writers among the top competitors. So, in addition to all that, of course, we have the tradition of hosting a number of conferences, including this one. Dan already alluded to the fact that we have lost Henry, and there isn't a day goes by around here that one or another of us doesn't experience some visions of Henry walking these halls, because there wasn't a day that he missed really up to the final days of his long life. And in addition to the ways in which Henry has been recognized that have been mentioned by Dan already, and which you'll hear something more about during the course of the conference, I hope that if you have a minute, you'll go up to the third floor of our library, where you'll find that there is a new and a permanent display that honors Henry and Henry's work. And it's fitting that his portrait rests, beside the portrait of Justice Robert Jackson, who, of course, as we know, was one of Henry's mentors. I also, as we look forward to the future, I want to add my thanks and my recognition to government and their willingness to take on the leadership of the Institute as we move forward. It's terrific that you do that, and we look forward here at Case Western Reserve to continue to work with you and to support the Institute in whatever way we can. Now, we are fortunate at the Canada-U.S. Law Institute to have a very strong partner, both the Institute and Case Western Reserve School of Law, a strong partner in our work, and that is the Canadian Consulate General in Detroit. Throughout its history, our institute and our law school has received considerable support from that source, and particularly not only from the Consulate General itself, but from individuals such as the Consul General and George Costeras, who are with us this conference. I offer deep appreciation to them and to the consulate, and in that spirit, it's my great pleasure now to introduce a friend of our institute and university, Consul General Robert Hope.
Well, normally at the beginning of these speeches it says, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," but I'm going to change that and say, ladies and gentlemen, and of course, Government Crane. Anyway, registered thinker. Well, as the Canadian Consul General in Detroit and responsible for the state of Ohio for the Canadian government, it's my great privilege to work on behalf of my fellow Canadian citizens and represent their interests not only here in Ohio but also in the states of Indiana, Kentucky, and Michigan as well. I think here in Cleveland we're here on a regular basis, and it's always a privilege to be here. Since arriving in September of 2006, I've had the great pleasure to come to know so many of you here this evening, and I think we've been able to build and strengthen through that relationships between our two countries. Our two countries, Canada and the United States, interact in a myriad of ways, such as through trade and travel, continental security on our borders and beyond, militarily in places such as Afghanistan, and by foreign diplomacy and assistance as evidenced by our robust cooperation in the wake of the tragic events in Haiti. Our countries are working on the combined challenges of energy, the environment, and the economy. Canada is the #1 supplier of all foreign energy to the United States, and a friendly supplier at that. With Canada as a strong and willing partner on environment and energy security, both our countries have an extraordinary opportunity to work together to deal with the common challenges that we face in a low-carbon future. Canadian jurisdictions have made great strides in the development of energy efficiency measures. Some of these efficiencies have been achieved in our oil sector, and Canada currently exports some 2.5 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products to the U.S. every day, almost 20% of U.S. imports. We're the #1 supplier of U.S. imported oil and have been for 16 years running. Together, we want to make investments to ensure that we retain this supply capacity for years to come. We've worked hard to bring the environmental impact of that production down, and progress continues. The Government of Canada has made a commitment to reduce Canada's greenhouse gas emissions by 20% from 2006 levels by 2020. Our oil sands facilities in Alberta and Saskatchewan currently account for approximately 5% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, and under this commitment, these facilities will reduce their emissions. Canada currently supplies an overwhelming 85% of all U.S. natural gas imports, or 18% of total consumption in this country, and we're the #1 source of U.S. uranium imports. We're also the #1 exporter of electricity to the U.S., and Canada has considerable scope to expand hydroelectric generation, is on the track to meet our government's commitment of 90% non-emitting electricity production by 2020. And we're a leader in terms of investing in carbon capture and sequestration. Now, regarding our economy, particularly here in Ohio, we make things together. Approximately 1/3 of our trade is intra-firm, with companies and subsidiaries on both sides of the border dealing with each other. I note, for example, the Frank Gehry designed Peter B. Lewis building right next door. This includes steel beams made here in Cleveland and refined through several processes in Hamilton, Ontario. It follows that our countries think and act in a like-minded way. And as with any friendship, we have differences at times. However, we attempt to manage these differences through dialogue and understanding. The Henry T. King Junior Annual Conference on Canada-United States Relations, I think, exemplifies that spirit of cooperation and dialogue. I compliment our hosts, Case Western Reserve University School of Law and the University of Western Ontario Faculty of Law, and the organizers at the Canada-U.S. Law Institute for the truly excellent job they've done in coordinating this event. For nearly 3.5 decades, the Canada-U.S. Law Institute has fostered Canada-U.S. relations, and we at the Consulate General of Canada in Detroit are grateful of this highly valued partnership. I also extend our great appreciation to Deans Rawson and Holloway, as well as the Institute's Executive Committee and Advisory Board. I note that today we experience some sadness, and in my case, as with many of you, a very personal sadness, as Canada's Honorary Consul here in Northeast Ohio and our dear friend Henry King is not here with us in person. Henry's bell will be with us, and when Henry's bell is with us, he's present in spirit. And I know that those who will have control of the bell will ring it as earnestly as Henry did. At least I hope so. We express really our great joy and optimism that the Institute will carry forward under the leadership of Government, Governor James Blanchard, and the Honorable James Peterson. Congratulations to you both, and thank you for taking up this cudgel and this bell. It's very important. We look forward to building our excellent relationships as well as establishing new friendships and partnerships with so many of you. You undoubtedly will be receiving a great deal of figures and numbers over the next day regarding the size and scope of the Canada-U.S. relationship. To put those in context, keep in mind that last year, U.S.-Canada two-way trade was worth well over $500 billion US, or should I say $500 billion Canadian dollars, approaching 600 billion Canadian dollars or US dollars. Two-way trade in goods crosses the Canada-U.S. border at the rate of $1.7 billion per day, nearly $2 million a minute. Canada is the biggest export market for the U.S. products, more than China, Japan, the United Kingdom, and Germany combined. Or, to put it another way, Canada buys 4 times what China buys from the United States. Canada is a larger market for U.S. goods than all 27 countries of the European Union combined, which has more than 15 times the population of Canada. And that doesn't include services, which make up a very large proportion of our economies. U.S.-Canada trade benefits every state in the Union. Using the most complete figures for 2008, Canada ranked #1 in 35 states, including Ohio, as the leading export market for your goods. Specifically, bilateral Ohio-Canada trade is worth $35.8 billion a year. And this trade supports over 250,000 jobs here in Ohio. So to summarize, the scope and strength of our relationship is the envy of countries around the world. We also know firsthand how relationships between U.S. states and Canadian provinces and territories, premiers and governors, state and provincial legislators and officials are key facets of our impressive bilateral relationship. Ohio is home to momentum, innovation, and dynamism in the face of the biggest economic policy challenges and opportunities of our day. And the highly integrated nature of our economies is a fundamental driver for economic prosperity on both sides of the border. This is a high-performing, high-yielding relationship that is ours to shape as the best next-door neighbors on the planet. There are, however, times where regulatory systems in our two countries are not necessarily in sync. The disparities create costs for our businesses and prevent us from reaching an optimal state of economic competitiveness. Our North American leaders recognized this in Guadalajara this past fall, and this conference is yet another example of our willingness to work together on very complex issues. I wish you well in your deliberations over the next 2 days, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention.
With that, I will, just at one point, we will turn it over to this evening's discussants in just a moment, but during the Q&A, I do want to point out for all of you throughout these proceedings that this wonderful young woman from the Xanten Court Reporting Service is taking down everything that's said. I'm kind of interested in what government looks like on the transcript, by the way. But so for the Q&A, all of these proceedings are, quote, on the record, unquote. Our student editors will be editing these over the next several months for publication in the Canada-U.S. Law Journal. All of our speakers have the opportunity to edit their remarks, but not the folks in the Q&A. So just keep that in mind as you ask your questions. And in order to introduce our first speaker today, it is my great pleasure to introduce Rick Newcomb of DLA Piper, who will be introducing Governor Blanchard.
Thank you, Dan. Ladies and gentlemen, Governor Blanchard, Mr. Peterson, Mr. Crane, it's indeed my pleasure to be here and to have the great honor to introduce my partner, colleague, and friend, Jim Blanchard. It's a particular pleasure for me in that as an alumnus of the law school, I was able to bring this fine gentleman together with this great institution. So it's truly a double pleasure. Jim Blanchard of Michigan has quite a distinguished career that many of you may not know about. He was a 4-term member of the United States Congress, 2 terms of governor in landslide elections, U.S. ambassador to Canada, and he did all this before he was 50. He then went to practice in Washington, D.C. He's the practice group leader, head of government affairs at DLA Piper, where he has a very active practice. He's a board member of a number of companies, including Chrysler and Enbridge. Jim was largely responsible for recruiting me to come to DLA Piper, and I have a great story to tell you. In making the decision to go to DLA Piper, I consulted with one person, so help me God, this is true. Henry King. He offered 2 views. He first said, you'll be leaving a smaller, intimate firm that has a southeastern focus, and you'll miss the charm and grace, and you'll be joining this behemoth. And then he said, the upside, though, is you'll get to work with Jim Blanchard. Now, when I asked Jim if he'd be interested in participating in this body, being the head of the co-head of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute, I have to tell you, he was delighted, and he accepted immediately, of course, checking his schedule. But it was a great pleasure for him to say yes, and it was a great pleasure to have for me to have him say yes, and when I communicated to Dan as well. We have a very active Canadian practice, and it's growing. For example, Jim and I will be leaving here to Montreal to participate in the Canadian Corporate Council meeting. Jim has many clients in Canada, and we spend many days just talking about our Canadian business. So it's with particular pleasure that Jim has joined us, and thank you, Jim, and we're glad to have you. Thank you.
And now it's my privilege to introduce Minister Peterson, Michael Robinson of Faskins Martineau in Toronto.
Thanks, Dan. Well, I should put on record that the government is a loud, raucous date bar on the Toronto waterfront. If anybody's been there, it's actually called the government. But these are 2 honorable gentlemen who would never be caught dead in there, I'm sure. My pleasure to introduce Jim Peterson. I'm not going to read you all of his many accomplishments, but the one that stands out always in my mind is that he is the 2nd longest serving federal parliamentarian in Canadian history. 23 years. Only Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of the country, was in Parliament longer. Jim's had committee heads and, as you've heard, was the Minister of International Trade, and had a wonderful title called the Secretary for International Financial Institutions, which involved a lot more than that too. Jim's always been a people person. He's always been open to new ideas, and I'd like to give you just three little personal anecdotes about that. The one new idea, however, he's never been open to, and that is abolishing the wheat board. And we have in the audience here Richard O. Cunningham, counsel to the Canadian Wheat Board for many, many years, who has successfully defended, 11 attacks on the legitimacy
14.
of the 14 of the Canadian Wheat Board by the United States Department of Commerce. And Jim Peterson was famed for having walked out on Bob Zellick in a Geneva ministerial meeting when Mr. Zellick demanded the abolition of the wheat board. That was a negotiation in the Doha round, 2005, I think it was, Jim. That shows you how long the Doha round has been grinding on. That was one of the meetings where everything was supposed to get resolved. My personal examples of what a fine people person and how open he is to new ideas, and that's a good thing for Canada-U.S. Law Institute as we move into this new era with Henry's demise. When Jim was chair of the House of Commons Justice Committee, by the way, that wasn't listed on his bio, that's one of the many committees he headed, I wrote him a letter and said that the Canadian Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act that was going for second reading was seriously flawed. Jim didn't have any problem with that. He said, well, look, why don't you come up to Ottawa and appear as a Crown witness and tell the House of Commons Committee what they've done wrong? I was amazed. So I did. Not your average minister who would do that when some persnickety lawyer acting for a bunch of banks, no, we didn't know each other, said, your government has drafted this bill all wrong, and I can tell you what's wrong with it. Anyway, Jim was open to that. Then another occasion was when he was Secretary of State for International Financial Institutions. And I was sitting in a room full of Dutch bankers that I represented. I mean, a room full, there must have been 20. And they were all getting ready for bear to demand or ask respectfully, I guess, for a ministerial consent under the Bank Act to do something. And they were all sitting there twiddling their thumbs waiting for the minister to arrive. Jim walked into the room, saw me and said, "Hey, Michael, I didn't know you were here. You acting for these people? Can they afford you?" That was one of the nicest things he'd ever said. Helped me considerably with my account. And there's one more story. During the Doha round ministerial, it may have been the same one in 2005 where he walked out on Zellick. Jim reluctantly agreed to consider, I put that in quotes, consider putting the Canadian agricultural, that's dairy, eggs, chicken, supply management protectionist system on the table for negotiation to try and induce concessions which hadn't then been forthcoming on agricultural subsidies from the U.S. and EU. As he said to me personally, when I congratulated him for this, he said, "I had no choice. It was 143 to 1. The denouement is, before the wheels hit the tarmac at Ottawa on his return flight, it had been suggested to him by the Prime Minister that he should recant that offer, and it was, and it's never appeared since." That's another story. But Jim, there's an example of being open to ideas, notwithstanding the federal government's position that it shouldn't be. So I'm not going to waste any more time because David is now going to ask the two important people to say things.
Well, welcome everybody to this start of what promises to be a very interesting and relevant and challenging conference dealing with many issues that are irritants between our two countries, and also if some of these issues can be resolved, creating opportunities for improved competitiveness for our industries. We're going to hear from your two new co-chairs, and in their presentations I think you'll get a good sense of why it is of such advantage to Cusley that it has been able to attract individuals with prestige and intellect that they can contribute to this organization. Now, as was mentioned, Henry King himself is not here, but the bell is. And what I'm going to do to start, because we only have about 45 minutes, is to ask each of our two co-chairs to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, whereupon I'll ring the bell, and we'll have some questions. I've got a couple of questions, so we'll open it up to the floor, and then we'll have just a wind-up, and this session is to get our neurons flowing for the rest of the conference, and our neurons moving. So, Jim Governor, could we ask you to, or Governor Jim, could we ask you to start now? One of the directorships that was not mentioned when you were introduced was Nortel, but you were there, I think, when it was in good shape.
Usually, yes, largely. Yes. Yeah, I would thank you. First of all, everyone, Dan, for your leadership, two deans, Bob Rawson and Dean Holloway, Consul General Noble. We work hand in glove with the Consul General, and George Casteros is here, on a lot of issues, and that's great. Rick, thank you. It's always good to be introduced by a law partner, because they're not going to goof it up. This is supposed to be a fireside chat, by the way, and there's no fire, so that, you know, this may be the closest we get to the truth.
If we had a laptop computer, we could put on the screen.
I was going to talk about, I was going to give a report from Washington on greed, corruption, and sex. Then I heard it's all on the record, so I have to change my speech. I'm really sorry for that. And by the way, Jessica LaCroix, again, thank you for your leadership. All of you have been, in a way, pioneers in U.S.-Canada relations and in the law. And so I consider this, Minister Peterson, this is a high-quality audience, as you know.
Boy.
Now, I must tell you, too, that I served as governor of Michigan with Jim's brother, younger brother, although he looks older, I guess, when he was Premier of Ontario. He was the first Peterson that I knew. But I will tell you this, I say very proudly, when I became ambassador to Canada, fortunately because Bill Clinton picked me, I was forever grateful, our very first guest to our home for dinner was Jim and Heather Peterson. So it's wonderful to share this role with you. Notice it takes at least two of us, probably more, to fill the shoes of Henry King. But we're here. So let me just give you kind of an overview as I see it from Washington. I made a few notes because I think that's where I can really add a little bit. You all follow politics. You follow it either in Canada or the U.S. and you're following the news. I would say this, for all the fits and starts, it's actually a pretty good era of good feeling. I think way back when President Monroe served as U.S. President, there was an era called the era of good feeling. In fact, everybody was in a good mood. There were not a lot of fights in Washington. Well, we have those now. But between the President Obama and Prime Minister Harper, actually, and between the various cabinet members, relations are actually very, very strong with a few hiccups. You all know that President Obama had a fabulous first visit to Ottawa, and they launched the Clean Energy Dialogue as a result of that. Even before that, Canadian Environmental Minister Jim Peterson had met with Carol Browner in the White House to lay the foundation for trying to synchronize our efforts in dealing with climate change and energy. You probably forget, we even take for granted that during the auto rescue, Canada and the U.S. and Ontario worked again, hand in glove, on helping General Motors and Chrysler. And Canada, by the way, has a board seat on both. In fact, I have fun because I happen to be on the board of the new Chrysler Corporation. I'm always telling the Canadian representative, George Gosby, that I have a vote equal to all of Canada. So that! Anyway, it's a lot of fun. And by the way, Chrysler's going to surprise a lot of people. Of course, you're all aware that Canada is serving heroically in Afghanistan. That will probably come to an end at the end of 2011. But there's an enormous amount of cooperation that's going on day after day after day on all the high-level issues. We also have 2 new ambassadors who get along famously and are going to do, I think, a fabulous job. David Jacobson, our ambassador to Ottawa, who was, I might add, Deputy Finance Chair for Barack Obama, a man near and dear to President Obama's heart. And many of you know Gary Dewar, the former Premier of Manitoba, who had a great deal of experience with dealing with our governors. And by the way, the governors and premiers got together in Washington recently and had a whole dialogue. They claimed it was the first time. The truth is the first time was when David Peterson and myself hosted a meeting in Traverse City in 1987, but we were not foolish enough to let the press come in and film it. We had a more candid discussion. But anyway, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. The Olympics. I know there was some critical coverage in the UK, but of course they've always viewed Canada as kind of a colony anyway, just as they view us as outliers. The fact is, the Olympics were a fabulous event. It was incredibly well received in the U.S. And I'm sure all the Canadians are very, very proud, including that last hockey game. I forget what the score was. I know it went into overtime. Actually, my wife is rooting for Canada. I don't know why. She said, I don't want our friends to be depressed until the next Olympics. I said, I know, but we all want to win. Anyway, generally speaking, things are going very, very well. I mean, we've had the Buy America dispute, and that's kind of a warning. And there's also the country of origin labeling disputes. Those are kind of a warning that if we don't watch things or manage things, which might look little at first, they can get out of hand. That's one of the things with trade. They get out of hand, they get in the newspapers, and pretty soon you can't get people to compromise or back off. I remember when Buy America was proposed, Jim, and it actually the idea came from the steelworkers. It was going to be, the Buy America provision would be in the stimulus bill. And it came from the Canadian head of the steelworkers who never thought it was going to apply to Canada. So I called up my friend, I don't have a client, but I just called up my friend Sandra Levin, who was chairman of the trade. I used to work for Sandy, and his sister worked for me. I called him up and I said, you got to watch that thing, you don't want it to have it apply to Canada. He said, well, our staff says it won't. Don't worry about it. I'm going to apply to anybody where we have good faith trade agreements. I said, oh, good, good. Well, we forgot that the procurement agreement between the 2 countries allowed the provinces to opt out because Ottawa didn't want to have to arm wrestle all the provinces. And so our states opted out, so all of a sudden we end up with a brouhaha that was unintended. And to walk that back took us, what, about a year. Yet I always felt administratively it could have been walked back within a couple of weeks. And it wasn't. I don't know whether it's because it got a lot of publicity, battle lines got drawn, but it's a real good example of what I saw as ambassador. You all feel, which is Canada can get sideswiped on issues, whether it's immigration, or Buy America, unintentionally, if we're not all careful. Just because the U.S. is just more insular, and these things happen. Or our system works differently. Let's hope softwood lumber will stay, by the way, dormant for a while, because I think that softwood lumber agreement has worked reasonably well. You may have comments on that, Jim. I don't know. All I know is that we don't want to let little things mushroom, because then they become pretty big and they hurt industry and jobs, and they're harder to solve. Let me just finish by saying that I don't know what's going to happen with the energy bill. As a Democrat, I'm very happy that President Obama was able to get, by the way, without Nancy Pelosi, it wouldn't have happened, get the health care through. I'm really happy about that. And I'm telling you, I know Nancy very well. I've known her, we've had mutual friends from college. She really did a heroic job at helping out. But so now the focus will probably be on financial service reform and energy. It's critical that whatever we do on energy and the environment gets synchronized or harmonized with Canada. There's no way to have policy if it's not really basically a North American policy. And thus far, I might add, there's been no attempt to sabotage oil sands in Congress. There was a few years ago. I am worried that, and you talked about the energy contribution. What people don't realize is that the oil sands greenhouse gases are far fewer than coal, and equivalent to heavy oil, which exists in California, not to mention Mexico and Venezuela. There's a lot of people that don't know that, but I am a little worried that we need to be vigilant to make sure that our two governments have a compatible regime on whatever is done. My guess is there's not going to be any cap and trade, by the way, this year at all, but there may be an energy/clean energy/jobs bill before the election. And with regard to the election, generally speaking, whenever you've had back-to-back victories like we Democrats have had in 2006 and in 2008, where the Republicans are reduced to the bare minimum in Congress, the pendulum will swing back. So the question isn't, will the Republicans gain seats in Congress? They will. Will they gain governorships? They will. The only question is how many, and what impact that will have on going forward. That's the real issue. But I would tell you this, I'll tell you this right now. Barack Obama is going to get reelected in 3 years. The only question is, what type of Congress is he going to be working with? Who will be leading Canada? And will we have to revisit some of these issues unnecessarily? And finally, the big issue I'm working on is the new Detroit River crossing called BRIC. It's huge. I hope you ask some questions about it, because it's not only the busiest trade corridor in the world, but we need a second crossing. We need a second crossing that's publicly governed. We're all working on it: Canada-U.S., Michigan, Ontario, Windsor, Detroit. And by the way, when we construct that, it will be, well, 10,000 construction jobs on the Detroit side, 15,000 on the Windsor side. And that's not counting who they buy steel from and concrete from. It's huge. It's the economic future of this region, and it's really important. You'll hear more about it, but I wouldn't want to end without mentioning that. And David, I know I've done my time, so I'll bring this and shut myself up in honor of Henry.
Good self-discipline.
Well, I just want to say what an honor and privilege it is to be a co-chair of this CUSLI. Didn't take me very long to say yes when I was asked to share this wonderful role with Jim. And the reasons are very simple. First of all, U.S. is Canada's closest neighbor, and it's its closest friend. And we have so much in common, but so much of an agenda to accomplish. I was so impressed by the distinguished directors from both sides, Canada and the United States. I can tell you this from Canada: they represent the cream of our trade bar. The fact that we were so strongly supported by the two law schools meant a great deal to me because of my academic background. And the fact that Jim Blanchard was going to be the co-chair. Jim befriended us in Ottawa, and to my way of thinking, he was the most distinguished ambassador, most helpful to Canada that I saw in my some 23 years there. Let me just give you a very brief story. 1995, we had the referendum in Canada, and the polls showed a month before that we were going to lose that referendum to Quebec separatists. It's a rule of international diplomacy that one state does not interfere in the internal affairs of another state. Jimmy Blanchard broke that rule. He invited Bill Clinton to speak before the House of Commons, and President Clinton said that the United States appreciated so much a strong, united Canada. And we won that referendum by about 54,000 votes. It was a cliffhanger. And that was Jimmy's diplomacy helping all of Canada. And we will always be grateful to him for it. And Dan, I am delighted that you finally solved the problem by calling us Gov and Mint, because Jimmy always solved the problem by saying Jim the good and Jim the bad. Like Jim, I think that if Henry King were here tonight, he could take great satisfaction from the fact that those who knew him best were the ones who determined that it would take more than one person to succeed him in this noble role. I've got five, very briefly, David, I have, ladies and gentlemen, I have 7 little topics I'd just like to hit on very briefly. One is financial sector regulation. There are a lot of proposals around the world right now as to how we're going to do it. We will not end up with a global regulator, but we will end up with our national regulators having to meet global standards, and they'll be tougher. One proposal coming out of Germany and supported by France is that there'll be a tax on banks, 1.2 billion euros. I hope that we will be able to oppose that. Certainly we will in Canada. We don't think that we will need it there, and I hope that will be our strong stance. I worry about what we saw, the concept that everywhere our FIs were too big to fail. Now, we had to act, and I agree with that. But what does that do in terms of the moral hazard? And how do we make sure that banks realize that they have to behave, and even when they know that they might or will probably be bailed out if they don't? And I would like to welcome very much the views of people here. Canada needs a single regulator, and if we can use the leverage of Case Western and this group to help us with that, terrific. Jimmy talked about the border. This is my second topic. And the Ambassador Bridge, it's 25% of all our merchandise trade goes over that. And as a trade minister, it was one of my very biggest concerns, and this is why I asked the Prime Minister to create a special cabinet committee on the bridge when it was stalling. Up to 10,000 trucks a day cross that bridge. And I referred to it as the aorta of our commercial body. It needs an operation, there's no doubt about it. We need this second crossing, and I'm glad that it's going to be not where the present owner wanted it to be, if at all. The border is still awfully thick. Passports, we have to get that Windsor thing cleared up because, as you know, you've probably heard before, if a truck goes from Toronto to Miami, it faces 14 stoplights, or 15 stoplights. 14 of them are in Windsor. We have a real problem, I think, in the U.S. in terms of balancing security with access at the border. And it goes right to the top. You've had top U.S. officials who've said that the 9/11 suicide bombers came from Canada, and that Canada has, we have as many problems with the Canadian border as we do with the Mexican. Well, this is, we've got a lot of diplomacy homework to do. A couple of weeks ago at our Liberal Thinkers Convention in Montreal, Derek Burney had proposed that maybe we should have a bilateral border commission. And I assume it would be somewhat along the lines of the IJC. But it would, and I would like you to consider that possibility. It would be a forum where we could streamline customs and entry, be accessible to importers and exports, harmonize many of the regs that Roger talked about, harmonize perhaps immigration and refugee policies. And I don't think that we should discount the possibility of a common external tariff in terms of thinning the border out. It would certainly help with our rules of origin, Jimmy, that you talked about. And we'll never get it in ag, we know that. But, and we could use this to help intensify police collaboration, security, drugs, organized crime, weapons. The third area is the WTO, which Michael referred to, and no, I did not dare go against supply management with WTO. We had, every meeting we had there, we had 30, at least, supply management people staying in the same hotel and insisting that they meet with us morning and night. And we were very well policed, and our governments never faltered from the supposition that we had to support supply management, particularly. And I believe this strongly, even though it does make this an outlier. When you look at the incredible agricultural subsidies that our agricultural producers face, globally, there are about $327 billion a year, which is 6 times the amount of all global foreign aid. The U.S. subsidies are about $47 billion, Japanese 48, European about 134. And these subsidies in total cost at least $500 billion of exports to the developing countries of the world. So I believe passionately that we've got to continue the WTO, much more so than the spaghetti bowl that's happening because of the bilaterals that are being done, maybe out of desperation, but those bilaterals do not have the capacity to rein in the obscene level of agricultural subsidies, which are so iniquitous and to our farmers and our producers and to the developing world.
Also, you can't deal with anti-dumping changes.
Right, can't. Right, David? Fourth area I'd like to hit on is just the deficit and the debts. We both face enormous problems here. Maybe ours are slightly less than the Americans. But cuts aren't going to be necessary to programs, but we're also going to need tax increases. And the mythology in Canada today is that we can't advocate tax increases. Well, I'm glad that the business community has spoken out, and some learned academics are speaking out about how we will probably have to increase taxes to get rid of deficits and pay down debt. And I commend BC and Ontario for advocating against great political difficulty, harmonized consumption taxes. Quebec has stepped in and picked up 2 of the points that the federal government abandoned, and I condemn that abandonment of, or that cut to the GST by 2 percentage points, which costs us over $10 billion a year. And let's look at the realities. We're going to need that money, and if we had it now, we'd be in a much stronger position. Fifth point, climate change, absolutely critical, and Jimmy touched on this. We are maybe not in the oil sands as bad a polluter as so many people think. There are the oil sands itself, there are 27 states in the United States that produce more greenhouse gas than we produce in the oil sands. We are the biggest consumers of oil in the world. We consume more in Canada than 35 million people than the 760 million people in all of Africa. So conservation is going to have to be part of our approach. Is a global accord possible? Heck, is it going to be possible to get one with the United States? You know, I'm not terribly optimistic, although it is absolutely critical that we do. Public opinion in the United States with respect to climate change is going the wrong way. It's fallen last year to 35%, previous year 44%. Those who think it's not a problem, now 17% versus 11% in the U.S. And I worry about the politics. There are 25 U.S. states that produce coal, and any one of these treaties, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, is going to require 67 senators to support it. So can we get that support to do the right thing and protect the world? Now, we have said that, or the U.S. has said, and others, that we will not have a deal, and our government too, that we cannot have a deal unless we have the developing world outside, and by that mean China and India. I disagree with that. The developing countries are not the ones who have put the carbon dioxide into the air. And they know it. And they're telling us this. And they're saying, we're not the ones who created this mess. You are. And you did it through your industrialization, and now we need our chance at industrialization. But we see how India and China are, particularly China, are trying to adopt greener economies in spite of incredible expansion. These pressures are going to get worse over the next 30 or 40 years as our population of the globe expands from 6.3 million to about 9.2 in 40 years. We've got to start, and the only way we will be able to have the moral suasion with respect to the developing world is if we lead by example. So let us do the right thing, and then we can apply the pressure. Fifth topic, global markets. The United States will always be the single biggest market for Canadian goods and services, and probably vice versa as well. And so let us keep nurturing that relationship, but at the same time, we see that Canada is now doing an FTA with Europe. Well, my priority would have been to focus on trade with India and China, enhancing it. After all, they have over 40% of the world population, and the economies there are growing at over 8% a year. Lastly, seventh point, productivity in people. We face, okay, just say one thing.
Okay. You can say the one thing, I wanted to ring the bell.
Good. Our single biggest challenge in both Canada and the U.S. is our demographic deficit. We are not reproducing ourselves in the way that we should. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I make a heartfelt plea to you here. As you crawl into bed tonight, that you will consider what you personally might do for your country.
Spoken like Governor Mark Sanford.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Our two speakers have set out quite an array of problems that our societies face. And on aging society, on climate change, on adjustment to globalization, to dealing with deficits, and many other things. I guess the question I would have for both of them is that we in the past have relied very much on our political institutions to sort out a lot of these questions. Yet it seems today that our political institutions themselves are becoming dysfunctional, that the whole tone of discourse such as it exists is to demonize your opponents, is to engage in the most extreme negative advertising and misrepresentation of of your opponents, to trivialize debates. And so my question is to both of you is, how are we going to reform our political system if we hope to deal successfully with any of these major problems, whether it's adjusting supply management or dealing with agricultural subsidies or getting an effective climate change program effect or dealing with in the United States Social Security and in both countries fiscal deficits, any of these things. If people are losing confidence in the political system and the political system itself seems to be failing the people. I mean, that's our sense looking at both countries is that we are moving in the wrong direction in terms of the political environment to solve difficult problems. I wondered how you'd like to respond.
Yeah, well, I'll watching them. I went to Congress in 1975, so people got along better. There were more coalitions between Democrats and Republicans. There was less acrimony. It's true, we did not have the 24-hour news cycle. Politics was not as much entertainment as it is now. It was not the running battle that it used to be. So it's a different era. I don't think we're going to go back to the old, quieter, more gentle era. I will say, though, that's one reason why the victory for President Obama on health care was so important. Democrats realized they had more to lose by not getting it done than by getting it done, no matter how the public perceived it. And my guess is, since the sky is not going to fall in, and his plan will be phased in, it's going to give a lot more confidence, ultimately, maybe not in the short run, ultimately a lot more confidence in the public that the government can do things. I might also add, working out arrangements between the U.S. and Canada, even though you have what is a conservative minority government and a Democratic administration, seem to be a lot easier than working out between the Senate and the House and the Republicans and Democrats in Washington. A lot easier. And I think, with regard, for example, to climate change, well, I don't think it's realistic we're going to have 180 countries agree to a global regime. I do think that we here in North America need to come to some sort of agreement for our own sake to also engender confidence on an important issue in the future and for future generations. And yes, set an example for the rest of the world, because then it's a lot more credible to go to Brazil or India or China and say, can you help out? I might add that we are beginning to develop different technologies in China, I might add, so that they can tap their shale plays, for example, and come up with natural gas rather than coal. But I'm a little more optimistic today that we're going to be able to solve some problems than I was. I am, and I'm much more optimistic about our two governments working together. That's why I said it's, at least between the U.S. and Canada, it's an air of good feeling. I don't know what we're going to do with the acrimony in Washington, but my guess is, because I've been through this myself, when the unemployment rate in Michigan was 17%, and I raised taxes temporarily, and I was the most unpopular person in North America, that once the economy begins to improve, your tea parties and your threats and the anger starts to dissipate. Right now, when people are really worried about the economy, their jobs, their kids' future, their houses, their retirement benefits, their investments, they get pretty angry and they blame whoever's in power. I think that's what you're seeing. Fortunately for Canadians, the economy, as I understand it, is not nearly as troublesome as it is in the U.S. Some of that will dissipate, David.
So you're not that worried about what's happening in politics?
You know, we had, back in our early days in the U.S., we had duels. Yeah. We had people being caned in the U.S. Senate. Remember, we fought a civil war. I mean, so I worry about it. Yes, I'm turned off by the 24-hour news cycle and what goes, these talking heads, these slogans. I'm really turned off by it. I really am. But I think some of it will dissipate. And I really think, and so obviously I'm a big fan for President Obama succeeding, because I think that will engender greater confidence in the U.S. and actually around the world. Because the world feels somewhat invested in Barack Obama as well. And he's very popular in Canada, last I checked.
Jim, do you think Parliament is functioning?
No, I've never seen it at such a low ebb. It enhances the cynicism of the electorate when the House is adjourned to avoid discussion of detainees in Afghanistan or things like that, or when it's done for blatantly partisan political purposes. And I'm not saying that the current government's the only one guilty. We paid a huge price in the Liberal Party last September when we said that we were going to throw the government out regardless of what bill we considered to be a question of confidence. And the public spoke loudly and clearly, and we went down to a 15 percentage point drop below the current government at that point. Now we've narrowed that gap and we're neck and neck, but I think the public wants us to behave better. As a start, what I would do is I'd totally change question period. We're the only legislature in the world, I think, that allows 45 minutes, 5 days a week of question and answer without any notice. And it just becomes a shouting match of acrimony. It's never designed to elicit information or shed light. So I would consider getting rid of it and going back to the British system of where you have to give notice, but you still have access to ministers.
Let me also add, too, in the U.S., the dysfunction is really the United States Senate. And the fact that instead of having to have a majority vote, they've decided to abuse a time-honored 60-vote requirement to break the filibuster. All of a sudden, automatically, every bill could be filibustered, and therefore you need 60 votes rather than 50 or 51. And what's happened is the archaic Senate rules have frankly been exposed by the 24-hour news cycle, and you have every senator trying to hold up the place to get something. And some of that has backfired. And so we'll see. I think they've really cooked their own goose in terms of how they abuse their rules.
I have some more questions, but we're running low on time, and I think it's fair that the audience have questions. And I ask each person when they ask a question if they could just identify themselves for the benefit of the stenographer. Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm Dick Cunningham. I'm a member of the Executive Committee of Presley, and I'm a lawyer in Washington. I was going to ask Jim Blanchard whether he agreed with me that bringing back dueling among members of Congress might be an constructive development, but instead, as a trade lawyer, I want to pose a question to Jim Peterson. Mr. Peterson, I must say I agree with just about everything you said about the WTO, but we're stuck there. The developing world sees trade liberalization in many ways as harmful to their development interests, and in the developed world, we're all scared of imports from low-wage developing countries. But there was a development very recently that I think was very significant. 6 of the heads of state, led by the heads of our 2 countries, sent a letter to their the other heads of state of the G20 saying that what we really have to do in the WTO is go after real increases in market access, real trade liberalization. Now here's the question I want to ask though. The countries that were involved there were Japan, France, Korea, the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. You may notice that all of the countries that you mentioned having substantial agricultural subsidies are in that list. The quid pro quo for getting market access, and the market access everybody wants to develop in countries, is going to have to be liberalization in agriculture. Are our countries willing to fight that bullet? The United States willing to really cut back, really reduce its agricultural supports? And is Canada maybe willing to do what I'm told one brave individual at least suggested, which is do something about supply management?
Dick, it's a very good question. The WTO is stalled, unfortunately. And one of the reasons, for example, is India is not prepared to open its borders to agricultural goods. They have about 650 million subsistence farmers with less than 2 hectares of land to support their families. And yet, they're one of the world's biggest agricultural producers, but 40% of what they produce gets wasted through rot before it gets to market. Now, if we wanted them to open up their borders, we would be asking that government to commit political suicide. And you can't do that. But you can arrange for asymmetrical solutions on the global basis. We did this with the softwood lumber. BC got a tax imposed, and Ontario and Quebec agreed to quotas. And we were able to come up with solutions which were maybe not uniform in need, but there were ones which were pragmatic in the circumstances, looking at the fundamental differences in the world. And I'll tell you this, I think with the huge deficits they run up, our governments should be looking at the ways that they can save money on the huge agricultural subsidies. It's an ideal time to consider it. And if we didn't have these subsidies, we wouldn't need our supply management programs in Canada. Our farmers could compete with the best in the world on a level playing field.
I remember once hearing President Reagan speak at the IMF annual meetings in Washington to all these assembled finance ministers. And he said something to the effect, now this is the real audience to talk to about agricultural subsidies. Related to that question is a lot of people are wondering what kind of trade policy the Obama administration is going to come up with. It's criticized in some quarters for not seeming to have a trade, that it's not seen to be up there on the radar screen, that there's business of doubling exports in 5 years, whatever the period of years is seen more as a mercantilist policy than as a free trade policy. And can you give us any insight on what the thinking is going on?
Well, I'm not much is going on. I mean, the good news, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that there is no attempt and no discussion to roll back, modify, or repeal NAFTA, even though that came up in the Ohio primary, you may recall. So let sleeping dogs lie. Let's not run around and brag that he hasn't done this, because then people might say maybe he should. So, but there hasn't been any real articulation of trade policy. It's to promote exports. Well, we're all for promoting exports. I mean, that's, so there's that. There's not much said. I think right now the president's trying to deal with a deep recession, huge deficits, need for energy, environmental policy, financial reform, and get through the elections. So he is not, I don't think, and I can't speak for him, interested in raising up new trade deals and aggravating the labor base and the Democrats. And I don't see any of the Republicans championing this either. During recessions, as all of you know, people are laid off. No one wants any trade deals. I remember that, as a matter of fact, in Canada, when the free trade agreement was first proposed. He has 3 agreements pending that somehow are going to need to be finessed. Colombia, free trade agreement, and that's more important for foreign policy purposes than it is economic, because Colombia is actually our best ally from the United States point of view in Latin America, Panama, and South Korea. South Korea will be the toughest one by far. So how those get finessed will tell you a lot about where we're headed. But I don't see a lot happening between now and the November election.
Let's have another question. Larry? And could you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, Larry Herman from Toronto. I wondered if either Jim Peterson or Jim Blanchard could comment on this. A lot of ideas, common challenges were mentioned when you spoke, but I'm a little bit concerned that there's no great Canada-U.S. project underway. There are a lot of working arrangements, exchanges, something called the Clean Energy Dialogue. These are political declarations. But, you know, when you look at Canada-U.S. history, there were many periods where the two countries were engaged in bold projects, resulting in major treaties. The International Joint Commission, the Permanent Joint Guard of Defense, the Columbia River Treaty, NORAD, the St. Lawrence Seaway Agreement, the Aspen Treaty, the FTA, NAFTA. But for the last 15 or 20 years, there's nothing bold or challenging that is engaging the two countries at the highest levels on a common endeavor. That's my perception. Maybe you disagree. I wonder if you could comment on what that means. Are we missing something? Are we missing opportunities to confront some bold challenges at the highest level?
Or are we living in an era of benign neglect? I guess is what you're asking.
Yeah.
Well, I've always felt that if you're not working to move forward, you're going to fall back. By the way, you missed Open Skies, which we did.
Open Sky.
Yeah, I worked on that myself, and
Right.
that was my idea. But I sit around with Alan Gottlieb and people like Jim Peterson, and the real issue is there a big idea that we can pursue? I don't have one offhand. We've talked about synchronizing all the regulations. You're going to talk about a lot of that during this conference. I don't have a big one right now other than, let's not discount the cooperation on automobiles. Let's not discount the need for a new crossing on trade. Let's not discount the fact that our leaders know we have to harmonize or synchronize our energy environmental agreement. They do. We're going to have to do that. But I don't have in my head an overarching proposal. I do like the idea probably of the Bilateral Border Commission. That still would be viewed as more incremental than cosmic. I don't, but I do agree with the idea that you want to always keep moving forward or things slide. And, it's overworked phrase that we take the relationship for granted, but it's true.
Jim, did you want to say anything?
I think the huge project that we have before us and that we have to solve is global warming. And we could show the world that there is a way to have opt-in if we could solve that issue between the two of us on a bilateral basis. And now you're going to have national governments, you're going to have state and provincial governments. Do we need special envoys, and this was Derek Burney's idea in Montreal, to go out and round up the political support at the provincial level in order to get this type of deal? Didn't we do that in the acid rain? I think so. I would think that that is one of the possibilities, and I certainly like the idea of a bilateral border commission that would have enhanced powers and operate much the way the Joint Commission does today.
Larry, do you have an idea? That's Larry Herman for the record, by the way.
No, it just struck me that for the last 15 or 20 years, for almost a generation, our two countries have not been engaged in the major projects. A lot of working arrangements, and that's good. But there's no big, bold idea that we're seized with on a bilateral basis and moving towards a common objective. There are no in other words, there are no treaties that we're looking at that kind of solidify these notions, like we did in the past with acid rain and Open Sky. The question is, why is that?
Well, we're pretty busy around the world. Haiti, Afghanistan, deep recession, financial regulatory challenges, Copenhagen. I mean, there's a lot.
Currency.
There's a lot going on. The auto companies collapsing. I mean, there really is. You think about it, just managing these things and trying to make sure the Middle East doesn't explode, that Russia cooperates instead of being treated as an enemy, that China begins to. I mean, there's a lot going on. Our two countries are working on all these things. Jim Peterson, by the way, and I really am thrilled to be a co-chair with him, knows more about the trade stuff than I do. But there's a lot going on where we're working together. A heck of a lot better, as I said, than the Senate and the House in Washington.
Yeah, And that was a great treaty that the Americans and the Russians signed today on nuclear. It brought Russia back into the fold. I think it's a very positive. We have two choices here. We have a long question from Michael, or a short question from Michael and from Jim. So what's it going to be?
2 words. Customs union.
Is that a question or a statement?
Yeah, that's a statement of the big issue that we should be working on without getting anybody upset, and will cure all kinds of problems. Everybody seems afraid to talk about it.
Well, if each country could adopt the other country's lowest external tariffs, it might not be a bad idea.
No, but that's far more realistic to work on than a uniform currency, which professors like, but no one's going to do.
And that's a big issue.
Yeah.
I'm Robinson, by the way.
I believe,
Asking Martin.
I believe very strongly that we should have a common external tariff.
Customs union.
If WTO succeeded, we could have no external tariff. Jim, you had a very short question or comment?
Yes, Jim McElroy from Toronto. And it's really for the governor, going back to your time in Congress. My sense is that there's a disconnect between the administration and Congress when it comes to negotiating trade treaties. For example, the administration signed a deal with Mexico, and they said Mexican truckers could come into the United States. And then James Hoffman, the Teamsters, said that's not a good idea. And so the Mexicans are essentially saying, well, we signed a treaty with you, but you're not honoring the treaty. Or you have the United States signed the third way around, and they made concessions regarding subsidies on cotton. And it's gone all the way up to the WTO dispute resolution. Brazil has won every inch of the way, and Brazil is going to retaliate, although I understand that they're not going to now. My question is this, is that the Congress doesn't seem to be all that excited about the administration going out and signing these free trade agreements when it comes time to actually allow foreign access. And my sense is other countries are starting to sense that. They're starting to sense that if you sign a treaty with the United States, it may not be honored. Not because the administration has bad faith, but because the Congress doesn't think it's a good idea. And is that worse than it's been in the past? It seems to be worse now.
I think it's currently probably worse because of the fact that we're in a serious recession in the U.S. with huge amounts of joblessness. Yes, and whether it's the left of the Democrats or the isolationists and the Republicans, you wouldn't get NAFTA through today if there was a vote. Forget it. But what's interesting is that ever since Franklin Delano Roosevelt, every president of both parties has ultimately favored trade expansion and freer trade. And I believe, again, I would never want to speak for Barack Obama because I know him, but not close. I'm not his advisor on this. But, I think Barack Obama is an internationalist. He sees America reaching out. You saw that in the campaign. He's coming up against the hard reality of the attitudes in Congress you outlined, which I think your criticisms are valid. So I don't have much of an answer, because I think you're right. But the fact is, I think President Obama, of all people, wants to reach out and work with the world. I also believe that Hillary does too, and Biden. So you got three people there that really believe in working with the world. They believe in trying to be a good partner with Canada. They believe in working with the United Nations, however imperfect. They also believe they're going to have to craft new systems. And you notice how quickly we went from G7 to G20. New systems of cooperation. So, and by the way, if the U.S. can work better with Canada, it gives us a good example to the world. Because other countries will say, if the Americans can't convince the Canadians of something, can't get along with them, why would we want to work? So the leverage Canada has with the U.S. affecting our credibility in the world is very significant, which is why having all of you here is important too, because you guys are on the front line.
Bears up your point, Jim, on climate change.
And could I just add to that, maybe we're important to how the U.S. is perceived throughout the world. I think the better our relationship is with respect we will have in the rest of the world as well. A lot of the power that we have is by being the closest friend of the United States.
Well, I'd like, on your behalf, to thank both our speakers. I think we've got our neurons charged up now for a very productive next few days. It's interesting that most of the issues we discussed ultimately have to be resolved at the political level, because ultimately they become issues of political settlement. And I recall a former Dutch Prime Minister who once said, "We all know what we have to do, but how would we get re-elected?" So on your behalf, thank you.
Thank you.
And again, thank our co-chairs as they not only started this